Hello and welcome to this PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Stacy and I will be your host. Just remember, throughout the webinar, you can find the chat button in the top left-hand corner. Select everyone in the to field rather than all panelists, and you use that to type out your questions, comments. You don't have to wait for the Q&A portion at the end. If you type any questions during the presentation at the start, we'll just queue them up for when we're ready to answer them. Today's guest is Dr. Marianne Hatzopoulou from the University of Toronto. She's an associate professor and a researcher in the Transportation and Air Quality Research Group. Thank you so much for joining us. I will let you take it away.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'll introduce myself a bit briefly. I'm a professor in transportation planning, engineering at the University of Toronto. My main research, what really excites me, what motivates me, is anything that involves building more sustainable transportation systems. How do we build cities that promote active transportation, walking, cycling? How do we build cleaner cities? How does the built environment really affect how we move, affects transportation? Today, what I'd like to talk to you about is a recent project that my group has done on air pollution and cycling. I think that's something that interests me a lot because cyclists are people who are responsible for the success of policies of urban planning that encourage active transportation. And yet we don't want cyclists to be the ones suffering the burden of the high air pollution. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. And then we'll go through the presentation.
Great.
All right, perfect. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that I've done over the summer that involves measuring air pollution throughout the entire bicycle network in Toronto. I'll start with a little bit of a disclaimer. For those of you who cycle, I still think you should cycle, no matter what you will hear today. The benefits of cycling far outweigh the risks. Obviously, there are some finer prints. If you are someone who suffers from asthma, if you have diabetes, have cardiovascular conditions, then maybe it's not a good thing to do cycling on bad air quality days. And, Environment Canada does have an application that tells you when the air quality is good and when it's actually poor. And the reason why I say that is we actually have done a lot of studies that continue to show that even in Canadian cities, even at the levels of air pollution that we think are really good, we are still able to detect health effects in healthy cyclists, healthy individuals who are cycling. Those effects are not very important. So if you're a healthy individual, you should continue to cycle, you should run, you should jog, you should walk. But this is very important for people who are vulnerable. And this, asks a lot of questions regarding, well, how do we design better cities that are just better for everyone? So what is the motivation? Why did we want to do this study, this particular project? Why we're doing this research? Well, first of all, because I really do believe that air pollution remains a concern in Canadian cities. And I say that even at the levels, this is not Beijing, we are not in Mexico. We do not suffer these enormously high levels, but even at these low levels, our health evidence continues to associate air pollution with health effects. Actually, Health Canada had recently cited that about 6,000 deaths in Canada every year are associated with air pollution. I don't know how many of you know how many people die in Canada from traffic accidents. I'll give you the answer at the end. If you know, go ahead and shoot your answers to Stacy. Now, why else are we doing this research? Well, because generally cyclists have the highest exposure among other road users. Because you're riding very close to the road, you're riding very close to traffic, and you have a higher breathing rate when you cycle or when you walk. Anything you're going to inhale is going to go even deeper into your lungs as opposed to somebody sitting in a car or riding the bus. Why else are we doing this research? Well, because we can. And I don't mean that as a joke. I actually do mean that because technology has now enabled us to do these things. Air pollution monitors are smaller and smaller. It's really easy to carry a whole bunch of monitors. I'll move to the next slide here. And you'll see this is a picture of my research assistant, Shan, crossing the road. In this little University of Toronto lunchbox, we have, I don't know, about $50,000 of air pollutant monitors. They are very small, but they are very precise. And now with this technology, we can actually carry them. We can have people wear them and walk around the city or cycle around the city, which is what we did, and measure air pollution all around them. And so technology is really an enabler of those things that we would like to do. Now, what did we do in terms of data collection? So over the summer, this past summer, in 2016, I had a bunch of cyclists who worked with me. So what we did is we installed air pollution monitors on their bicycles. We also installed GPS units so that we can track them everywhere we go. And so the cyclists and their bike become a human sensor of their environment. Anywhere they're cycling, they're basically measuring air pollution. We also have their location. So at the end of the day, we can fuse this information together and look at air pollution across bicycle paths in Toronto. So we selected a whole bunch of bicycle routes, as well as roads that carry a lot of cyclists in them. So some roads don't necessarily have, a bike lane or a separated cycling track, but there's a lot of cyclists on them. So that was also part of our data collection. And that's what we did. And we just, let these cyclists go around and gather data for us. So let me show you some of our results. This is a small zoom. I'm going to zoom in later on. This shows you basically the levels of ultrafine particles on various cycling paths in Toronto. Ultrafine particles are very, very small particles in the air. For those of you who understand measurements, they're basically 100 nanometers in diameter. So very, very small. The reason why we're concerned about them is actually the smaller the dust particle, the worse it is for your health, because it means you can inhale it and it goes deeper into your lungs. Particles that are generated, let's say, from construction activities are actually quite coarse. So most of the time, by the time they reach the nose, you can actually filter them out. You don't actually breathe them in. Very small particles come mostly from combustion. So there's actually no activity. You can't crush anything and generate a nanoparticle. And they're mostly associated with gasoline and diesel combustion. Guess what? It's traffic. This is mostly a map of traffic-related air pollution on bike facilities. To give you an idea of the levels that we have here, anything that is in green is actually good. It's not very polluted. Anything that is in yellow is an average, resembles other, European cities like France, London, Switzerland. Anything that is in red is basically a high level. That should not be something that you should be exposed to every single day. Anything in the black is an extremely high level. And actually, I was surprised that we were measuring levels this high in Toronto. So if we look at this map, you can clearly see, all the trails. If you're familiar with Toronto, everything, slightly outside of the downtown core, trails that run around the river, etc., are not so bad. But once you get close to the downtown core, and I'm going to zoom in here, you actually see the massive amount of red and black. Now, a lot of you are not familiar with Toronto, so I'll give you a little bit of an idea. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Stacey, just, yes, not, yeah. So basically, this is really here the downtown core. And you have all these streets, King Street, Adelaide, Richmond, Front Street. All of them have not just a lot of traffic, they're also very dense. You have really tall buildings around the roads. So which means that everything that gets emitted from cars stays kind of trapped inside the roadway, inside the canyon, rather than dispersing, which makes for really, really high levels. If you look here, north-south on Yonge Street, everyone knows Yonge Street. No, Yonge Street is actually very polluted. If you look at Bloor Street, this is Bloor. Bloor is not so bad. But if you look at an alternative, which is DuPont, and a lot of people don't like to take DuPont because they think they're going out of their way, the levels are very different. So there's a lot of variability. And so knowing actually these values, it's something very important for cyclists, because by changing your route slightly, you can actually decrease your exposure quite substantially. Now, one thing that we've done, and I'm going to explain these box plots a little bit to show you what they really represent. And I mean, for the sake of this presentation, I really just want you to focus on these horizontal blue lines here in the middle. Everything else represents, all the other values. So just focus on these blue lines. What we did is we actually wanted to see whether the levels across different types of bicycle facilities were similar or different. And what we found is that the levels of air pollution on cycle tracks, a cycle track is basically a major bicycle facility. It's one that is separated physically from the road. So these are, on the main arterial where you actually have quite a bit of space for cyclists. You have either concrete bollards, you have something that is separating them from traffic. And actually we find that on these ones, the levels of air pollution were the highest. And again, no surprise, because the way we do our planning in the city and in a lot of cities is we try to put bicycle lanes where we have space for them. We just think about road space. So we end up always slapping them on the roads that are the biggest and that attract the most traffic. These cycle tracks, these are the bicycle lanes that attract the most cyclists as well. So therefore, the most polluted bicycle facilities are the ones that have the highest number of cyclists on them. This is even worse than actually bicycling on a major road. So if you see my second blue line, on a major road without any bike lane. So some parts of Bloor, for example, where there is actually no bicycle facility, if you are on Bloor West, you're better off bicycling without any bike lane, and levels of air pollution are going to be lower. Now, again, there's also safety. So I'm not talking about safety here and accidents and all of that. So that air pollution is not everything. This is also if you're bicycling on bike lanes. So bike lanes are basically painted lanes. Anything that involves any painting but no separation, physical separation. The levels are kind of like being on a major road. And you really only decrease your exposure when you go down to the pathways, the laneways, and the trail. And no surprise. I mean, these are trails, they are far from the road, but you can't actually cycle around the city, go from where you want to be, from where you are to where you want to be just using the trail. So obviously you have no choice but to be on those more polluted facilities. The second one shows the distribution of black carbon. So black carbon is basically soot, black. And this is mostly generated by trucks, by diesel traffic. And it's basically showing you the same thing. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. So black carbon and ultrafine particles are really two pollutants we're very concerned about because they are small, they're generated from combustion, and we know that they affect the health of individuals. I'm going to do a little bit of comparison with Montreal because we did actually a similar study in Montreal. And we found some interesting results when we compared the two cities together. If you look at Montreal, so in Montreal, we kind of had the same thing. For those of you who don't know Montreal, Montreal is basically an island, and it's connected to the rest of the region with bridges. I'm not showing you here the bridges. The downtown core is in the blue rectangle. So Montreal also kind of shows the same variability, that once you move outside of the downtown, you're in the West Island or you're on the North Shore, the levels are nice, these are really beautiful rides, but most of the time when people want to go to work and go to places, they're not going to be riding in these places. They're going to be riding close to the city center. And that also shows quite a bit of pollution. But let's actually compare Montreal and Toronto side by side. If I look at them side by side, this is downtown Montreal on the left, and this is downtown Toronto on the right. Just even looking, and this is on the same scale. So just even looking at the figures, you can actually see how much more red and black you see in Toronto compared to Montreal. Now let me jump and show you the numbers. Don't worry about these distributions. I only want you to look at the first lines here that says mean. So the average levels of ultrafine particles in Montreal, the average level is 18,000. This is 18,000 particles per cubic centimeter. So we actually count them per cubic centimeter of air. Look at Toronto, 23,000. There's actually a huge difference between Montreal and Toronto. This is something I was not expecting as part of the study. We use the same equipment, we use the same approach, and we're really surprised to see the difference between those cities. Look at the maxima. So the worst level encountered in Montreal was 71,000. The worst level in Toronto is over 300,000. So there's actually a huge difference between those cities. And we're trying to analyze this better and try to understand why is it the case? Is it just there's more people? Is it just that there's more traffic in Toronto, or there are more other mechanisms, like maybe meteorology, maybe weather, maybe something about those two cities that make them so different? So let's look a little bit at some effects, and this is how I'm going to be wrapping up, maybe in 15 minutes. In terms of meteorology, again, this is air pollution, air travel, air mixes, and even if you have, we try to minimize the number of cars, or you do something with respect to the emissions, meteorology does affect air pollution. So one thing we found that wind speed really decreases air pollution. On windy days, air pollution is low. We found that temperature increases air pollution. So on hot days or hot times of day, the air pollution is higher. We actually found that weekend is best. Well, no surprise, because there's no car. So weekends are best. During the working week, we found that Monday is actually the best day of the working week. And we're thinking that's also the weekend effect, because the atmosphere is still clean. After Saturday and Sunday, you haven't had time yet to accumulate a lot of pollution. We actually found that Tuesdays and Wednesdays are the worst days. In terms of time of day, 6 to 8 a.m. is the worst time of day, and 11 to 2 p.m. is the best time of day. And you can kind of see the correlation with traffic, right? 6 to 8 a.m. is really the worst time of day for traffic. That makes it really bad for air pollution as well. Let's look at some of the built environment. Some things that actually decrease, we found that the distance to Pearson Airport. So the further away you are from Pearson Airport, the better the air pollution, because Pearson Airport is a major airport and a polluter in its own right. We actually found that parks, for example, decrease air pollution. So if you are closer to parks, you actually enjoy better levels of air quality. Building footprints. So more buildings actually increase air pollution. Building height increases air pollution. So this is what I'm saying about the urban canyons. If you are in downtowns with a lot of buildings and really tall buildings, these tend to kind of trap air pollutants. So all the emissions that are generated stay within that downtown core. One thing that was really surprising, we found that the number of trees on the roads, we found that roads that had trees on them tended to increase the levels of air pollution. And we're thinking is because trees kind of cause this trapping effect. It's very complicated. I'm not going to go into that. So trees are different from parks. If you are in a park, if you don't have emissions and you are in a park, the levels are going to be low. But if you are emitting and you have trees around you, they're going to create some sort of a trapping effect. Please don't understand that as we shouldn't be building trees. We just shouldn't be having a lot of cars. So I don't, think of this as a way to, minimize the number of trees in downtown cores. Proximity to highways, obviously, the closer you are to highways, the higher levels of air pollution. We looked at the road types as well. And like I told you, the major roads and the cycle tracks were the worst. The bike lanes, the minor roads were better, and the trails, the multi-use pathways were the best. Some other relevant work that I want to wrap up with, it's not just about cyclists. So what we're doing is, we're doing cyclists, but we're also doing pedestrians. We're also doing fixed points. So we go to certain locations and we install our instruments. And we don't move them. They stay fixed for an entire, summer or an entire duration of many weeks. We have cyclists. We also have pedestrians carrying it. And we also we're running a panel study. A panel study is basically we recruit people who carry air pollution monitors, but they also carry physiological monitors. So here you can see Shan, she's carrying a blood pressure cuff on her all day. Every 30 minutes, the blood pressure cuff is programmed to actually measure her blood pressure. Some of them wear Holter monitors. So Holter monitors is basically the monitor that you put on your chest to measure, to do your electrocardiogram. And we're actually looking at, the associations between exposure to breathing polluted air to how your body is reacting right away. And we're finding these associations. If you're healthy individuals, you won't feel it. You won't feel it in your body, but the fact that we can actually detect it really means that people who are vulnerable, it's very important to look at what's going on in their body and their physiology and how to minimize these effects. So this is just for the panel study. We're recruiting people. This was an advertising. Are you healthy, non-smoking adult between 18 and 60? You're willing to participate. And so we had people participating in our study. It was really nice. That was over the summer. We met all sorts of people. A lot of people were very interested in this. It was a huge time commitment because they have to wear all of these sensors for a duration of 2 days, but we got very interesting data and very interesting knowledge from that. Some conclusions and final thoughts for this presentation. I still say air pollution remains a concern in Canadian cities, even at levels that are below the standards. Like, governments have, air quality standards. And even though we are below these standards, it doesn't mean we're well. It doesn't mean we are good. Standards are just, are just levels that are set to make sure that, most people are fine, but it doesn't mean that we can't detect health effects at levels below standards. Also, we are incurring rapid changes in vehicle technology, in fuel efficiency. We have autonomous vehicles soon on our roads. The Google car, they may be electric, they may not be. New cars, new engines are basically emitting all sorts of new things, even though a lot of new cars are very fuel efficient, so they don't burn as much fuel as they did before. The amount of pollution and toxic things that are generated is actually very different. So this soup of air pollutants is changing as technology changes, and it doesn't mean that we are safe. It just means that the composition of air is changing. One thing I say is that exposure while you commute is very important. A lot of people will say, well, I'm only walking for 2 hours in a day, and the rest of the day I'm sitting in school or I'm at home. Does this really matter? Actually, yes, it does. It does matter to your daily exposure. And the last thing I would wrap up with is that what we really are trying to do, we're not trying to say you should stay at home, because nobody can avoid air pollution. But what we're saying is that when we plan cities, when we try to, develop policies, all these policies that encourage active transportation should be fair. So cyclists, pedestrians, people who are using active mode of transportation should not be responsible for the burden, because they are the ones who are making these policies successful. They're getting out of their car, they're moving on their feet or on their bikes, and we don't want them to suffer the burden. We have to better inform our policy. That's basically a wrap up. I thank you very much, and I welcome any questions you have.
Well, thank you so much. I definitely was surprised by a few of your findings. I was especially surprised by the trees on roads bit. So I understand the distinction that if you have a park full of trees, this is a good influence on air quality. But that if you had a road that had perhaps a boulevard in the middle where they had planted some trees, I think mostly for aesthetics or possibly even with the intent of having cleaner air, that those are trapping potentially pollutants, or at least that's the theory you're working on now. So that was very interesting.
Yeah.
So our first question here, I'll go right to question from Lawfield and the grade 7s there in Hamilton, Ontario. Mm-hmm. They wanted to know, what is the worst city in the world for air pollution?
It has to be Beijing.
And how do those levels compare? So we compared Montreal and Toronto and found that there was a significant difference there, especially in the worst readings, in the worst places, as well as the mean. How does Beijing compare to Toronto, perhaps?
So if the average in Toronto is around 23,000 to 24,000 ultrafine particles, in Beijing is actually around 100,000.
Wow, so big difference.
Absolutely.
And yet, I think more cyclists, if I'm not mistaken, but probably just more of everything.
More of everything. No, but I mean, a lot of people, you see it in Beijing when they cycle, they're actually wearing, masks. Yeah.
So are masks able to filter out these ultrafine particles?
Yeah, they do. To a certain extent, yes, they do. Again, I wouldn't say that they're highly recommended in Canadian cities. If you're a healthy individual, it's okay. I mean, I say that, and then I give this entire presentation talking about all the health effects of air pollution. So it sounds contradictory, but I don't think if you're a healthy individual, you're not going to suffer any health effects at this stage, at these kind of levels. But it's nice to know how you can, reroute to avoid your exposure, or better understand how we plan our cities. But I wouldn't use this, as a health recommendation that everyone should be wearing a mask. I don't think so.
Right. And I just forgot to remind you there, it would be great if you can hit stop share, and then we'll just be able to see you a little bit larger while you're answering questions. Perfect. So the next question then is how can we reduce air pollution in our larger urban areas?
That's a very good question. I think that number one is we have to reduce the number of cars on the road. This is very important. I mean, what we're doing is we're basically building denser urban areas, right? There's this whole movement for building denser, walkable cities, you know, live and work, and all of this is great. But if actually we're not doing anything to the number of cars on the road, we're just bringing people closer to air pollution. So we definitely need to reduce the number of cars on the road with things like congestion pricing, you know, making the downtown unavailable to all the ones who want to drive. There's public transit, there's active transportation nodes. So we have to do that. Trucks are a big problem, and the number of trucks is increasing in our cities. Again, more people do online shopping. So maybe not a lot of people are going to be driving, but we're going to start seeing a lot of trucks wiggling their way around the cities. Our trucks are a major source because that trucks are diesel fuel. So there has to be very dedicated places for trucks, and maybe the timing of truck deliveries should be worked out in order to minimize air pollution. At the same time, again, when I say, you know, urban canyons are the worst thing because you have really tall buildings, you have a narrow road, and everything stays trapped because of the recirculation of air. We're building these urban canyons while we shouldn't be having cars on them. We should just make these bicycle boulevards or pedestrian boulevards and not have cars at all.
Interesting. So there's lots of potential in there for ideas of how we can improve and reduce this air pollution. What about what our individuals can do? So those students who are watching us today, what can they do to improve the overall situation or reduce their exposure, or both?
Well, if you want to improve the situation for everyone, I say you have to, you know, give up your cars and not accept to be driven everywhere, to walk, to use public transit, because that's one way actually to reduce the number of cars on the road. Now, if you want to reduce your exposure, that's the thing. And you have to know what the air pollution looks like in a city, which is what my research group is trying to do. We're trying to generate these maps of air pollution, make them available to the public through, you know, websites or through apps on your phone, so that when you actually can see it, then you can make decisions on how to avoid it. And this is basically what we are trying to do. Without that kind of information, it's difficult to figure out how you're going to reduce your exposure. Because again, it's not that every single busy road is going to have the highest levels, because like I said, there's buildings and there's all sorts of other things that affect air pollution.
All right. So next up, we have a question coming from Ottawa. It's Ms. Tibshirani's class, and they would like to know, what is the city with the least air pollution worldwide?
Oh, wow. I would not know how to answer this question. I think there are a lot of cities with very low levels of air pollution in the world. Ottawa is probably one of them. We actually did sampling in Ottawa. So the levels in Ottawa are even lower than the levels in Montreal and in Toronto. Even Vancouver is actually lower, but Vancouver has a lot of wood smoke burning in the winter, and that does affect also air pollution. I can look that up. I would not know off the top of my head the best.
I guess it's tough because how do you define a city as well? Because smaller cities will, by definition, have less.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But very interesting to know, even within Canada, we definitely have some cities that are lower on the scale of ultrafine particle issues there. Okay, so let's see what I have next here. So we talked about how we can reduce air pollution. Will we be able to leverage technology, do you think? We've got all these new technologies emerging, lots of innovation. Can we innovate our way out of this problem, do you think?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question, because one thing that I like to do as part of my research is always contrast technology with behavior. Right? Will technology save us, or will we have to alter our behavior? You know, electric vehicles are going to make their way on our roads, but again, millions of electric vehicles on Highway 401 will not solve the problem of congestion, right? And there's, you know, all sorts of technologies out there that are, you know, improving fuel efficiencies of cars or trying to have zero emission vehicles. But at the same time, I think if we don't reduce consumption, if we don't alter our behavior, there's only a certain way we could go. We've done a lot of research with alternative fuels, not electric, so not zero emissions. So basically biodiesel, compressed natural gas, all sorts of alternative fuels. The problem is, once you put an alternative fueled car in a congested road network, you don't get the full benefit of the reductions from this car. So even alternative technologies will fail if the system is not working very well. So it is really a combination of both. And there's a lot of technology to better measure air pollution. We'll have a better understanding, but if we really want to solve the problem, it has to be also better urban planning, changing behavior, all of that. Technology will not save us, no.
It seems like that's always the answer. It's never all the way down one path. We always have to moderate and do a bit of both. So we are almost out of time here. I'll just maybe squeeze in some questions about more what you do. So we've talked a lot about what your research findings are and applications of that. But as a researcher in the area of transportation and air quality, what types of other researchers do you find yourself collaborating with?
Okay, well, very, very nice question. So I work a lot with transportation engineers. So one thing that I do a lot of is not just measuring air pollution, but I do a lot of modeling. So what we do is we build traffic simulation. So it's kind of like a game. It's like SimCity. So we're simulating all of Toronto. We're simulating every single car on the road as it accelerates, as it decelerates. And we're trying to find ways to better, reduce traffic emissions. So we say, if we, the intersections, the signals are intersections are coordinated, right? Sometimes you're driving on a road and every time you hit an intersection, you stop at the red light because they're not coordinated. Looking at things like creating pedestrian roads or creating, pedestrian zones. So we do that, all of this in our simulation, and we try to see which kind of changes will actually have the best benefit, because a lot of things you can't measure them in real life, but you could do that in a simulation model. I'm working now with the City of Toronto. The City of Toronto is collecting tons of data on traffic counts, tons of data, but they haven't really been processing them, and they haven't really looked at it from the angle of emissions and air pollution. So we're trying to generate greenhouse gas emissions. We're trying to figure out what the carbon footprint of Toronto is for transportation and how can we reduce it. So I do a lot of simulation, a lot of transportation engineering work.
Well, it's nice to know that our levels of government are using some evidence-based research methods to support potentially future policies they may enact. So that's always a plus to hear that.
Yes.
Just before we wrap up, I guess what I'd like to do is a last question of any advice you would have or wisdom you could share for anyone who might be interested in pursuing a career in this area of transportation research?
Well, yeah, one thing I would say is when you're in high school, you don't really realize what an engineer can do. Most students, when you're in high school, you think an engineer, well, either I'm going to be a civil engineer, build building, or a mechanical engineer and do HVAC. So you have all these notions of what engineers do. They're really, really narrow. I think my advice is that is better understanding of what engineering is, because engineering is changing tremendously. I'm an engineer. I'm doing air pollution, I'm doing health, I'm working with epidemiologists, I'm measuring heart rate and blood pressure, and the nature of the questions in the world, the nature of the problems are becoming so complex that a single discipline can't solve them. You really have to be connected to a lot of people, collaborate with a lot of people, and the kind of research you do becomes very interdisciplinary. And so I would say that I definitely encourage engineering. I would say there's so many things you could do when you become an engineer beyond building bridges and buildings.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I have certainly learned a lot. I imagine our students have as well. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Next up on PIR Live event, we are going behind the scenes at the Canada Science and Technology Museum. More information on this and other PIR Live event webinars is available at pirweb.org. Thanks for tuning in and have a wonderful day.